All right, today we're jumping into a really important case from the Delhi High Court that fundamentally changed how we look at India's Domestic Violence Act. It all starts with a widow's fight for support, but it ends up asking a massive question. When something goes wrong, is the entire family legally responsible, or does the law demand something, well, a lot more specific? So here's how we're going to break this all down. We'll start with the personal story behind the case, then get into the nitty-gritty of the law. After that, we'll step into the courtroom for the legal showdown, unpack the judge's final decision, and then zoom out to see why this case still matters so much today.
Okay, let's get right into it. Because before we can talk about the legal principles, you really have to understand the human story that sparked this entire legal firestorm.
So our timeline starts with a marriage back in 1995. But everything changes in 2006 when Razia Begum's husband suddenly passes away. What happens next is a long, winding legal journey, starting in the lower courts and climbing all the way to the Delhi High Court, which is where our story really takes shape in 2010.
But here's where things get messy, right from the very beginning. The first court, a magistrate, orders 5 of the husband's male relatives to pay maintenance. A sessions judge later tweaks the amount. But look at the key issue here. Both courts made a huge mistake. They just issued a blanket order. They didn't say who specifically had to pay what. And even more critically, they completely skipped a step. They never actually proved that a domestic relationship, as defined by the law, even existed with each and every person they named. This was the fundamental flaw that sent the whole case upstairs.
So, what is this domestic relationship that the lower courts just glossed over? This is so important. Let's look at the exact words of the law that are at the very heart of this case.
First, let's talk about who you could even file a case against. Now, remember, this is back in 2010. Section 2Q of the Domestic Violence Act was crystal clear. A respondent had to be an adult male person. That little detail, adult male, is going to become a really big deal later on, so just tuck that away for a minute.
And here it is, the absolute core of the whole case. Section 2F gives us the definition. A domestic relationship isn't just about being related by blood or marriage. The law says you have to live or have, at any point of time, lived together in a shared household. That phrase, live together, is everything. It's not enough to just be an in-law. You had to have shared a home.
Now, the law does broaden this a bit. Section 2S says a shared household can include a joint family home. But, and this is the key part, the requirement of having actually lived there in a domestic relationship doesn't go away. That is the constant, unbreakable rule.
And you really have to understand why getting this right is so critical. This isn't just a civil case about money. No way. Under Section 31 of the Act, if you violate a protection order, it's a criminal offense. You could face up to a year in prison. So a vague, sloppy order from a judge could literally land innocent relatives in jail. The stakes could not be higher.
Okay, so we've got the facts, we've got the law. Now let's step into the Delhi High Court and see how these two sides went head-to-head, battling over these exact definitions.
The whole thing really boiled down to these 4 massive questions. Can you just sue every single in-law? Is proving you live together an optional step, or is it mandatory? Can a judge just say you all pay without specifying who pays what? And if they do, does that violate the very foundation of the Act? The answers would set a huge precedent for years to come.
And here you can see the two arguments clashing directly. On one side, Razia Begum's lawyers argued based on her status. She was the widow, she had a right to the family home, and these were all family members. But on the other side, the husband's relatives pushed back hard. They said, hold on, the law is the law. We didn't all have a domestic relationship with her. They even pointed to one relative, Abdul Wahab, who they said had never lived in that house. Their point was simple. This vague order is unfair and illegal.
So, how in the world did the High Court sort this out? Let's get inside the judge's head and break down his step-by-step reasoning and the previous cases he looked at for guidance.
The High Court's analysis was just laser-focused. It was a 3-step takedown. First, the judge said, there's a clear statutory violation here. The lower courts just didn't do their job of applying the definitions in the law. Second, there were major factual holes. There was no actual proof that all these guys had lived with Razia. And third, he recognized the incredibly dangerous criminal implications of these sloppy orders. Now, the judge wasn't just inventing this out of thin air. He was leaning on precedent. He pointed to the Vijay Verma case from that very same year, which had already laid down the law. No domestic relationship, no maintenance order. Full stop.
And if that wasn't enough, he also cited the Harbans Lal Malik case, which had come out just a few months earlier.
It hammered the point home even harder, saying you can't just drag all the in-laws into court. You have to prove they lived in that shared house with the wife. The precedent was overwhelming.
All right, so after laying all that groundwork, the facts, the law, the precedents, what was the final call? Let's look at what the High Court actually ordered.
And the final order was frankly brilliant. It was a perfect balancing act. The court completely threw out the flawed orders from the lower courts. It said, nope, start over. The case was sent back down to be decided correctly. But, and this is so important, the judge didn't leave Razia Begum with nothing. He granted her interim protection, saying she couldn't be kicked out of her home, and ordered 2 specific relatives to pay her interim maintenance.
And here's that precision we were talking about. The court gave a specific number, 5,000 rupees a month, and it named the exact 2 individuals who had to pay it. This provided total clarity and removed the criminal risk for everyone else who had been unfairly looped in.
Now, this 2010 judgment was obviously a huge deal, but the law is never static, right? It's always evolving. So for our last section, let's see what's happened since and how the ideas from this case have held up over time.
And this is just fascinating. You can literally see the law changing before your eyes. In 2010, the Abdul Roob case was all about a strict interpretation to prevent misuse. That's why that adult male part was so important. But then, a few years later, the Supreme Court case of Hiral Harsora came along and completely changed the game. It got rid of the words adult male, making the law totally gender neutral. The focus of the courts started to shift from just preventing misuse to making sure victims were protected, no matter who the abuser was.
So, what does that mean for our case? Well, even with all these changes, Abdul Roob is still absolutely essential reading. It stands as this crucial procedural safeguard. It's a foundational judgment that screams at lower courts. You must do your homework. You must establish a domestic relationship before you issue these powerful, life-altering orders. It's a lesson in basic judicial fairness that never gets old.
And you know, it's worth knowing a little bit about the judge who delivered this landmark decision, Justice S.N. Dhingra, a man who came from truly humble beginnings. He was known for being incredibly practical and direct, always trying to find that perfect balance between protecting real victims and stopping people from misusing the laws that were designed to help them.
And that brings us right back to the central question this case forces us to ask. It's a question that lawyers, judges, and all of us are still grappling with today. How do you create a law that is a powerful shield for victims, but at the same time has enough safeguards to protect innocent people from being unfairly targeted? The legacy of Abdul Roob versus Razia Begum is that it demands we never stop asking.